This is an awesome project. We're going to be building out a full date picker. As you can see on the right, here's the final example. We have a button. It'll open up to this really simply styled date picker. We can go find a particular month, let's say beginning of January. On the 15th, we click that date. It updates our button. It also sets that as our selected date. Choose a different date, for example, 28th of April. There we go. It shows up on the button and it selects that date. So it's essentially a fully fledged date picker. And this is a great project for you to be able to try out yourself first. And really the only hint that I'm going to give you is inside of this project, we're going to be using date FNS, also called date functions, in order to handle all of the different date computations. It's a library in JavaScript, a super popular library called date-fns. And let me just type that out for you. It's just date, FNS, just like this. So if you want to try this project out on your own before watching me do it, date-fns is the library that we use for all of the different date interactions. And essentially all you need to do is create a button here that's going to open up this modal that selects a date. We have a left button and a right button, which go backward and forward in the month. And then whenever we click on one of these dates, we want to select that. And next time we open up our picker here, it's going to be selected to that particular date. And the actual starting HTML that we have is perfect because this is very common when you're building JavaScript applications. You're going to have a static version of a site, and you can see none of these buttons actually work. It's just hard-coded to today's date, which is the 27th of October. If we look inside of our code here, you can see it's all hard-coded. October 27th, October 2020. We have each one of these dates individually hard-coded. So everything inside of here is hard-coded, but that's really common when you're writing out JavaScript for yourself. It's really common to write out all of the HTML for the structure of your document hard-coded, and then slowly, piece by piece, replacing this hard-coded information with the JavaScript information. So it's really nice to be able to practice going from this hard-coded example to a fully working JavaScript example, because that's how you would do it in the real world. Also, if you have a designer on your team, they very might likely give you some hard-coded HTML and CSS like this, and they'll say, hey, this is what I want it to look like. And you just had to build out the JavaScript functionality on top of it. So it's very common that you get information handed to you like this. Oftentimes you need to make minor tweaks to the HTML as you go, but in this example, the HTML is perfectly formatted exactly like we need it to be. So if you want to try out this example yourself, here's the last chance before I actually get into and start building out this project. So the first thing that we're going to build for this project here is we need to get all of our different libraries set up. So let me just open up the console, and we're going to be using Parcel for our bundler, and we're going to be using date-fns for all the date interactions. So we type in npm init-y to build us out a boilerplate package.json, and then we can install date-fns. It's just date-fns, and this is going to be very quick to install because this is really just one single package. If we open up our node modules, you can see that date-fns is just this one single thing. There's nothing else to it except for this one package, which is really nice. Now, of course, as we know, Parcel is much bigger, so we can say npm i-save dev parcel-bundler. And this is going to take a little bit of time to install, so I'm going to come back to you when it's done. Okay, that just finished downloading. So what I can do inside of this package.json is just create our scripts that we've had before. We can do a start script, which is just going to run parcel index.html, because that's what our index file is called. We're also going to need a build script. We can just say parcel build index.html. So now we can build and run our application. And to see if this works, let's just run npm start. This should hopefully pull up localhost 1234. As you can see, if I open that up, there we go, close out of our old version. And now we have this exact file open, this index.html here. Now, before I get started with coding, the first thing I want to do is to create a .gitignore file. This is because if we're going to be using Git as our version control, we want to make sure we don't commit this cache, dist, or this node modules. So we're going to ignore node modules, dist, and .cache. And if you're using Visual Studio Code and you have a Git project initialized, for example, if I just were to come in here and say git init, you'll see that these files up here are grayed out because they're inside of our gitignore, which is exactly what we want. So now the next thing that we need to do is actually start writing out our code. And we need to think about what is the first place that we want to start. And for me, in my opinion, the easiest thing to get started with is the open close button, because it's kind of detached from everything else and it stands on its own. So the first thing I want to do is make this button, when we click on it, open and close our date picker. So let's look at our HTML to see what different things we need to select. You'll see we have this container here that includes everything, including our button, so we don't want that. We have our date picker button here. That's something we need to select. So let's just copy this class and we're going to real quick create a script.js. And in here, we're going to select our date picker button using document.querySelector. And it has the class of date picker button, just like that. And let's just reference this inside of here. So we can say script source is equal to script.js, defer that, and there we go. Now we actually have our script being loaded. And just to make sure this works, just do a simple console log hi, inspect over here, and we should see inside of our console hi being printed out. So we know that this is hooked up. That's great. Now the next thing we need to look for is our whole date picker itself. And right here we have our date picker, and you'll notice it has the class show. And if I come up here, you can see show is going to give this a display of block, so it's going to make it visible. If we remove the class of show, it now hides our date picker. So we can show and hide our date picker with this class, which is really nice. So let's just save it so we have it visible, copy this date picker selector, and in here we can say const date picker equals document.querySelector of date picker. There we go. Now all we need to do is set up an event listener on this button to make it hide and show that class. So we can say date picker button.add event listener on click. And inside of this event listener, all I want to do is take our date picker. I want to take our class list and I want to toggle the class list of show. So either hide it or I show it. Then if we just remove this default show so that it's no longer shown by default, we can now click this and it'll show and hide our date picker. So this is exactly what we want. Now the next most simple thing to work on is to make it so that our button displays the current day as opposed to this hard-coded day. Because right now it says October 27th, which is correct, but tomorrow this hard-coded value is no longer going to be correct. So if I change this to, for example, October 2nd, which is clearly incorrect, let's go into the code and make it so that we can actually set this date picker button's text correctly to the current date. So inside of script.js, I want to create a new function for setting our date. So we're going to say function set date. This is going to take in the date that we want to set to our new date. And if you remember correctly, we need to update this text here. So we can say date picker button.inner text. We need to set that to our date inside of a format. And luckily, this is where date fns comes in handy. So if we just go over to the date fns documentation over here, what we want to do is we want to format our date. So the best place to start is just going to the documentation and searching for format. And if we scroll through here, we can see immediately there's a helper function called format, which formats the date. If we just expand this so we can really see what we're working with, you can see here that format has a bunch of different patterns that we can use. As you can see, it's a very, very, very long list of patterns. And the way that this works, if we just scroll down to one of these examples, is we say format, we give it a date, and then all we do is we pass a string, which uses those characters that we created, those format strings way up here. We just combine these together in a way that we want to create the correct string layout. So let me kind of show you how this works. The first thing we need to get is the month name of October. So if we try to look here for month, it'll be listed on this left-hand side here. We can see month, standalone. Then if we scroll a little farther, we'll see month formatting. This is what we want. And you can see here, if we want the full month name, we just put 4 M's, 4 capital M's. That is how we get the full month name. So now let's look at how we import this function for formatting. What we need to do is come up here and say import. We can say just an empty object for now. We're going to get that from date fns. And we want to import the function format. So we can just type in here format because these are imported as individual named exports as opposed to default exports. So we can say we want the format function from date fns. Then we can call format with our date. And if we just pass in 4 M's here, that's going to give us the name of our month. Now if we call set date with the current date, which we can get by just calling new date, that gives us the current time and date. If I save this, come over here, refresh this page, you can see here that it says just October because it's using that MMM. If I change this to 3 M's, it now gives us a short version of our month, 2 M's here and it gives us the number, 1 M, and again it gives us the number but with slightly different formatting. Let's just change this back to MMM so that we have the full month name. Now, the next thing that we want to print out, if we look over here, is going to be a space, and then the day with the actual, ND or ST at the end of it. So let's try to find day. We just scroll down here a little ways, we can see day of month. That's exactly what we want. And the one that has the ST and ND at the end is DO. So inside of here, we just put a space because we know we want a space between them, and then we type DO. Now, We come over here, you can see it says October 27th. Okay. The very last thing is we want a comma and then the year as 4 different numbers. So we'll put a comma, a space, and then if we scroll till we find a year, which is way up at the top here, calendar year, there we go. It looks like we can just use YYY. That's going to work for our use case, or we could use 4Ys. Let's just use 4Ys here. So we say YYYY, click save. Now you can see it says October 27th, 2020, because that is the current date. And then we're getting that current date from this new date here. So this means if I want, I can go into our index.html and just remove this hard-coded date because we're populating that by JavaScript. And as you can see, we're getting the correct date up in here. And the next step is going to be populating all the information inside of our date picker. We need to populate this month and year, as well as all of these individual days down here inside of our date picker. And the first thing I kind of want to focus on is this month and year up here, because that's going to be much more simple than all of these hard-coded days down here. So we can get this here. As we can see, div has a class of current month, and that contains our month and our year. We just copy that inside of our script.js. We can get the const date picker header text, and that is just document.query selector of that class. Let's just make this side of our page much smaller. There we go. And now what we need to do is make it so we can set up our date picker. So I'm just going to create a new function called setup date picker. I'm going to pass it in our date, but how exactly are we going to get our date? We have no reference to our date right here. And we can't just pass in our current date because obviously that doesn't make sense, because this could be our current date or it could be a different date that we've selected. So what do we do here? Well, one thing we can do is create a constant variable called like current date. And we can update this whenever we click on a button, but I don't really like this idea of having this hard-coded global date. Instead, what I would rather do is set our date on our actual button itself, our date picker button, when we set a date. So we could say date picker button dot dataset dot current dot selected date equals, and we want to set it to our date. But we can't just set it to our date like this. We need to set it to a format that we can parse and unparse from a string. The best way to do that is, again, with datefns. We're going to be using something called Unix time. If we just type in Unix here, we can get Unix time and from Unix time. So if I just expand this, you can see there's a function called get Unix time. We pass in the date, and it gives us the timestamp of that date. So what we can do is say get Unix time of our date, and we just need to make sure that we import get Unix time. And now we're actually setting the timestamp of our date onto our button. Now here, when we set up our date picker, we can actually get the date from our button. So we can say const current date equals, I'm sorry, we'll just call this selected date equals date picker button dot data set dot selected date. And we need to get this from Unix time. So we can say from Unix time and pass in our selected date and just import that function. So let me show you exactly how this works. If we just inspect our page here and whoops, we go over to our elements, you can see that when we get our button, it has this data selected date, which is set to this timestamp. This is the current timestamp of exactly the time that I'm at right now in the Unix timestamp format. And that's what this get Unix time function is giving us. Then we can get the selected date up here by converting that from Unix time. And if we pass that to setup date picker, and we just create that function, setup date picker takes in the selected date. Then what we can do, if I spell that correctly, is just console.log selected date. Now if I save, go over to our console, click this button, it's printing out the current date. And that's perfect because it's the currently selected date and not necessarily the current time that we are actually in. That way, when we select a different date, all we need to do is call this setDate function with the new date. Is going to update the button text as well as update the Unix time on our button itself inside of here, this data selected date. That way, when we come in here and convert from Unix time, it's giving us the currently selected date. So really all we're doing is storing the date on the button itself, which is great because we don't have to worry about some weird global variable inside of our JavaScript. So now the next thing to do, we just go into our setup date picker, and instead of logging out our date, if you remember correctly, let me just expand this again so we have more room. Up here we have our date picker header text. We can take that, set the inner text to be equal to, and all we need to do is format our selected date. And the way that we want to format this is with our month, so 4 M's and 4 Y's. And instead of this comma, we're going to have a hyphen between them. Now, if we save this, you'll notice it doesn't look like anything changes, but in our index.html, if we just remove this hard-coded October 2020, you're going to notice it's properly populating this with the actual month that is currently being selected, which in our case is October 2020. So now the next few things that we need to do is hook up these left and right arrow buttons to move our months, as well as hook up our actual dates to show the correct dates and to be able to click on these dates. And you could either go with showing the dates next, or you could go with clicking these buttons next as like the next logical step. They both make perfectly good sense to me. I'm going to go with these arrow buttons myself because I think they're a little bit easier to get set up. So inside of the script.js, let's create a function for doing that. We're going to say setup month buttons. And in here, we're going to pass in that selected date. And down here, we're going to say function setup month buttons selected date. And what we need to do is create functions that are going to run on click. So we first need to get references to these left and right arrows. We can do that up here with previous month button and next month button. We could say const previous month button equals document.query selector. And that's a class. And we can also get our next month button, and it just has the class of next instead. So now we have our previous and next month buttons. And down here, we could say, for example, next month button dot add event listener on click. And inside of here, what we want to do is essentially go on to the next month. So we would need to set our date. But we can't actually set our date because we're not setting a specific date. We just need to set up our date picker again, but with a new date. So we could say setup date picker. And we want to take our current selected date and essentially add 1 month to it. So again, to do that, we have datefns to the rescue. If we just search here for example, add month, you can see there's this function called add months. And all you do is just pass into it a date and the amount of months you want to add, and it's going to give you a new date with that number of months added on to the end of it. So we can import add month, or I'm sorry, add months. And down here, we can just say add months, pass in our date, we pass in 1, it's going to add 1 month to our actual date. And then it's going to go through and set up all of our event listeners again. But we only want this event listener to fire once because it's going to recall setup date picker, which is going to recall setup month buttons, which is going to re-add our event listener. And if we don't make this only fire once, it's going to add new event listeners over and over and over again, which is constantly going to add more and more event listeners. So we can pass in here an option where it just says once true. And this means that once we click on this button, it's going to completely remove this event listener. It's only going to fire once. If we just make sure that says selected date, now when we click this next button, you're going to notice it increments our month, and we're slowly counting up by months one at a time as I click on this button. Now the next step is going to be to do the same exact thing, but with our previous month button. So let's just copy this all, come down here, we could say previous month button, and here we need to use a function called sub months. And if we come up here and import sub months, this is exactly the same as add months, but it subtracts. So here we're subtracting 1 month from our selected date, and we're only making this fire once. Now, if we save this, you're going to notice it looks like it's going to work, but there's actually a few bugs. This next is working just fine. When we click back, you notice it's technically working fine, but what's happening is we're adding a bunch of event listeners onto our previous month button, instead of just having this fire once. I can show this by just saying console.log here. Now, if I inspect this page, come over to our console, when we click the previous button, it'll say here once. It's working just as we expect. Now, if we click next a few times and then we click back, you're going to notice it says here 61 times. That seems a bit ridiculous, but the reason for that is because we're never removing our previous month button event listener. We're just adding a new event listener over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. We're essentially just constantly adding more and more event listeners onto our button. This is not good. So instead, what we need to do is rethink this system because clearly it's not working very well. So instead, we're just going to use a global variable to represent our current date. That is the date inside of our date picker. And the selected date is still going to be referenced on our button. So the selected date is the date that we've selected, for example, October 27th. The current date is just the date we're showing here, for example, April, May, June, July. We're going to create just a global variable called current date. And by default, this current date, we're just going to set it equal to the actual date that we are right now. That's our, current today's date. Then what we can do instead of these setup month buttons is we don't even need these to be set up individually whenever we set up our date picker. We can set these up just one individual time, and we don't need them to fire once anymore. So what we can do is we can say here we want to use our current date, and we want to add one, and here we want to use our current date and subtract one. Then up in our setup date picker, we have our current date, and we can format our current date. And actually, we don't even need to pass in our current date here. Down here, we can just say we want our current date to equal sub months of current date and 1. And then we can call setup date picker. So all we're really doing is updating this global variable and then calling this function to re-render our date picker with the correct values. Let's do the exact same thing up here, but using add months instead of sub months. And now we can get rid of this log here. We save this, we click here, and we can go backwards. We can go forward. And now we don't have any of those issues with these different events being fired more than once, because the event listeners are only ever being added once. And we just have this current date variable, which contains the date for our date picker itself. One thing you'll notice though is if I close our date picker and reopen it, it opens back up to wherever we were before. You may prefer this feature, but I'd rather have it open up to our currently selected date. So whenever we click our date picker, what I want us to do is take our current date and I want to set it to the selected date. That way, if I, for example, navigate all the way to March or February, close this, reopen, it's going to bring us back to our current date, just so it recenters the user whenever they click on the button and open up the date picker. Now the next step is going to be working through all of these different dates and rendering them out properly. So the first thing we need to know instead of our date picker is our selected date, which we're already passing in up here. That's going to allow us to highlight the date that's currently selected. We're also going to use our current date to get the month that we're in so we can get all of these different weeks. So let's create a function to do that. We're just going to call this setup dates, and this is just going to take our selected date because again, like I said, we need to have the selected date to highlight the correct date that's selected. Then we can create that function, call it setup dates, and it's going to take in the selected date. Now, in order to get the dates that we need, essentially we want to get the first day of the week and the last day of the week inside of the month that we're in. So for example, in October, you can see we have some months here or some days here from September because the 1st of October is on a Thursday, and we want to fill this out all the way from Sunday to Saturday. So in order to do that, datefns has some really nice interval functions that we can use. Specifically, we can use the hday of interval. If we click on this and just expand this out a little bit, you'll see we pass it a start date and an end date, and it's going to give us an array of dates in between the start and the end date. And for us, if we give it a start date of, for example, September 27th and an end date of October 31st, it'll give us all of these dates in between that we want, which is exactly what we need. So in order to get the start date and the end date, again, we can use more functions inside of here. For example, start of month. This will give us the start of the month of a given date. So if we pass it in, for example, the 3rd day of the month, it's going to give us the 1st day of that month. So we can pass it in our current date, and it's going to give us the start of the month. We can then do the same thing with start of week, and this is going to give us the very beginning day of the week. So we get the start of our month, which in our case is October 1st. Then we get the start of that week, which is September 27th. We can do the same thing down here where we get the end of our month and the end of our week, which both happen to be the 31st of October. So let's do that now. We have a constant variable. We're going to call it first week start. And we're just going to say here, this is going to be coming from our selected date. And we first want to get the start of month. So we say start of month of this, and then we want to get the start of the week of that. So we'll say start of week, just like this, and make sure I spell month correctly. And let's make sure we import start of week, start of month, and we're also going to need to get end of month. And let's just format this with end of week, just like that. We can just copy this first week start down to have our last week end, and this will be, end of week and end of month for our currently selected date. We don't actually want to use the selected date here. We want to use our date picker's current date. So just like this, now we can get all the dates in between, which is just each day of interval, and that'll be up here. We just need to import each day of interval, just like that. So now we have each day of interval where we pass it our first week start and our last week end. This is going to give us all the dates in between. And this is actually an object which takes a start and it takes an end. So there we go. Now we have all the dates between those days. We can just loop through each one of these. So we could say dates.for each date. Let's just say console.log date. See if this actually works. We're calling instead of dates right here. So if we inspect, and when we go to our console, click on this, it's going to give us all the dates. If we scroll to the very top, from September 27th all the way down to October 31st. So it's giving us all the dates in the month. If we clear this, go back a previous month, you can see if we scroll to the top, we're getting from August 30th all the way down here to October 3rd. So again, it's giving us the full set of days inside of that period. Now all we need to do is show those in our grid. In our index.html, you can see we have this date picker grid dates selector we can use. We can just say const date grid equals document.query selector of that selector. And then down here, the first thing I want to do is just clear our grid by saying inner HTML equals an empty string. Now you can see we no longer have any dates in our grid. And here we can create a new date element, which is just document.create element. And if we go to our index.html, we can see that each one of these is a button and they all have the class date. So we can create a button and we can give it the class of date, just like that. And then for now, we can just add this to our date grid. So we can say date grid dot append child of date element. Now, if we open this up, you can see right now we have all of our different grid items. Right now, they don't have any text or anything inside of them, but you can see all the items are showing up. To give them some text, let's just say date element dot inner text equals date, and we want to get the actual date. So we can just say date dot get date. Let's just move this up above. Now you can see we have all the dates being printed. And if we move over here, you can see it gives us the dates for September, August, July, and so on. It's changing the dates every single time. The next step is going to be getting all of our specific classes on our dates. So the first thing I want to check for to see if, for example, our dates are in the same month. As you can see here, these dates from September, we are giving them a class of date picker other month date because they're coming from a different month as opposed to the month that we're currently on, which is March. So for example, all these dates down here for April, we want to show as a different color. So what we can do is just say if, and we want to check to see if they're in the same month. And again, datefns has a function called same month. Is same month, pass it to dates, it'll tell you if they're in the same month. So we can say if, for example, the months are not the same, so if same month is not the same for our date as well as our current date, then what we want to do is take our date element and we want to take the class list and we want to add in here that date picker other month date. Let's just make sure is same month is being imported just like that. So now immediately if we come over here, we should see that all these days that are in a different month are showing up as a lighter gray color. And the next step is we want to add this selected class to the currently selected day. So to do that, we can just say if is same day, which is just the same as is same month. Just make sure that this gets imported up here. What we can do with that is we just want to say that if the date and the selected date, and this is important that we use the selected date here because we want to actually check the date that's selected by our button. And if those are the same, then we want to just take our date element class list and we want to add the selected class onto there. So now if we save, open this up, you can see this 27th is marked as selected. Now the very last thing to do is just add an event listener. So we could say date element.add event listener of click. And whenever we click on this, we want to set our date to our current date and we want to unshow our date picker. So we can say date picker.classlist.remove show. So now we click on a different date, for example, here, you can see this changed to October 1st. We open this up, we're in October, we can come back, we can come forward. You will notice a slight issue though. Our selected date is not actually showing as selected. So if we just look through our code a bit to figure out why that is, it's kind of difficult to see. So let's just come in here instead and do a console.log of our selected date to see what this is every time we go through. So if we just inspect our page, Go over to our console. You can see our selected date is the 27th. That's what we expect. If we come in here and open it up again, you can now see the selected date is October 1st. And if we move backward and forward, you'll notice it now says our selected date is undefined, which means when we're calling setup dates, we're clearly not passing our selected date through. So let's just look for all the instances where we call setup dates. As we can see, these are the only two places, so clearly selected dates is always being passed in. So now we move up a step where it's selected date, we can see where we're calling select or setup date picker. Right here, as you can see, we're not actually passing through the selected date. Same thing down here, we're not passing through the selected date. We need to make sure we pass that through. So what we can do is just scroll all the way up here where we got our selected date. We just copy that down into each one of these onto their own line, just like that, and then pass in our selected date. Now, if we select the first, we go back and we go forth, you see it's properly showing this as selected. Same thing if we do a different one, it's still showing up as selected. And that's all it takes to create this date picker. In the next and final video of this course, we're going to be building out a larger project, which is a multi-page application that has a shopping cart that spans across all these different pages. It's a great project with a lot of different features, and it's the most real-world styled project in this entire course, so I can't wait to see you there.